The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Ah yes, that moment you realise you're walking among giants. Enjoy the perks of a university ranked in the top 300 in the world. Study online, on campus, or both. Massey University. Success from 1,000 little moments. To find out more, visit massey.ac.nz. Ki te kahore he whakakitenga ka ngaro te iwi. Without foresight or vision, the people will be lost. Kia ora koutou, I'm Stacey Morrison. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to Conversations That Count, Ngā kōrero whai take, a thought-provoking series brought to you by Massey University and The Spin-off. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome back to Conversations That Count, Ngā kōrero whai take. This is the fourth and final episode of our third season, and today we're having a very special kōrero about te reo Māori. We'll look at what's being done to revitalise and increase access to reo learning, but also examine some of the existing and ongoing barriers to reo acquisition and to Māori learners. What are they? What are the historical and contemporary reasons for them? And how can we collectively move past them? He kōrero whai take kai te haere, an amazing kōrero is on its way. I'm your host, Stacey Morrison, and as always, today we have two fantastic guests. They are education thought leaders. From Massey University, we're joined by Te Rina Warren. Te Rina is a senior lecturer from Massey's Te Pūtahi Ātoi School of Māori Studies, where she teaches and does amazing research in the area of Māori education. Also joining us today is Rawiri Wright. Rawiri Wright is tumuaki or principal at Te Kura Kaupapa Māori o Ngā Mokopuna in Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Wellington, and also co-chair of Te Rūranganui o Ngā Kura Kaupapa Māori o Aotearoa, the national organisation for Kura Kaupapa. But really the way we do things is to turn it over to you two to introduce yourselves as you'd like to. Tēnā koe te rangatira, Rawiri.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rawiri Wright o Pengua. He uri no ngā tirau kaukau i patetere, te rawa waka me ngā tika hungunu ki te wairua. Ai tēnā wā koe te tumuaki o Te Kura Kaupapa Māori o Ngā Mokopuna, kai te upoko tika, koa hoki te tumuaki takirua o Te Rūranganui o Ngā Kura Kaupapa Māori o Aotearoa. Tēnā koe te.
Tēnā koe, Te Rina, kai a koe te wā?
Tēnā tātou, ko Te Rina Warren tōku ingoa. He uri ahau no Ngāti Rangitāne, no Ngāti Maniapoto, no Ngāti Whiti Kaupeka o mō kai Pātea. He kai hāpai ahau I te kaupapa o Te Aho Tātarangi ki te kuninga ki Pūrehuroa, ki Massey University. He mō kai hoki ahau o te iwi, e kawe ana I ngā mahi a te iwi. Me te mōkai o takuta mahine.
Naua no tomate kimi, ko tāua. So as dedicated parents, as also people who love education in terms of te reo Māori, tēnā kōrua I te hono mai, because we really want to dive into this kaupapa and some of the barriers that still exist, some of the things that could be easily fixed, some of the things that are stopping the true revitalisation of te reo Māori, particularly in our education system. And there's some irony that we're speaking English to do that, but we need to, at this point in time, for wider understanding. Engari, a tōna wāpea. Ka tai atu tātou ki taua tihi. At some point, hopefully, we will get to the point where we can all understand and engage in te reo Māori. So if we start to look at where we've come, and this has been 50 years since the petition to bring te reo Māori into our schools. Te Rina, could you give us a current scape as you see it of, in 40 years, say, of Kura Kaupapa in particular, and Māori education being in schools? Where are we at? How do you describe it?
Oh, dear. I suppose my description would have to start pre the last 50 years. So when our tūpuna first sought education pathways for tamariki, and it was actually Rawiri who put me onto this fact that our tūpuna were sending tamariki to school in New South Wales to learn with Samuel Marsden before the establishment of mission schools in Aotearoa. And so I think our quest for knowledge, our quest to grow our understanding has always, as a fundamental part of who we are as Māori. So the phrase ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama is a never-ending cycle and a never-ending quest that we have to enhance our understanding of the world in which we live. And so in the early contact stages, this was one of those pathways to send tamariki to school in New South Wales with Samuel Marsden. Following that was an invitation to missionaries to come to Aotearoa and subsequently establish schools. And that became another pathway by which we enriched our understanding of the world in which we lived in. And particularly during those times, one of the focuses as well was not only reading and writing, which was originally in Te Reo Māori, and we know that the first publication in Te Reo Māori was, of course, the Bible from our mission schools, but also the expansion of our understanding around agricultural aspects and our economic development, our economic survival, but also that leading into that during the 1820s and 1830s, Māori were the major exporters of the South Pacific. So we grew on our understanding of an agricultural system and our ability to provide kai and other resources to our incoming manuhiri, and also the other manuhiri that we're joining in Australia. So we grew and expanded our understanding of these networks. So I think education is a foundation of who we are as a people, and that obviously had led on to the establishment of mission schools, the uptake of reading and writing, and the Western curriculum as we understand it and how that developed. And then, of course, what happened is that due to legislation and, of course, a large population change in terms of our incoming manuhiri, I think maybe around 700,000 manuhiri we had received by 1890. So there was a huge change in dynamic around Te Reo Māori and its use and application in our typical living styles. And of course, our population by that time had receded quite a lot, I think around 40 to 50,000 by that same time. So we were at a number imbalance, which of course impacted the power imbalance of which language was being spoken. The language that was spoken was also supported by the legislation that had been introduced and enforced by our settler government at the time. So we have a number of legislations that we came through as well. The Native Trust Ordinance in 1844, which provided land to mission schools because, of course, at that time we wanted to learn and establish these schools. But, of course, that was a little bit overturned by subsequent legislation, which eventually introduced the English language into our schooling system and enforced it as the only language to be enforced in our education system because, of course, mission schools were in Te Reo Māori. And then by 1880 Native Schools Code, Te Reo Māori was being discouraged. Māori beliefs and practices were being discouraged. And then 27 years later with the Tohunga Suppression Act, of course, that limited our ability and our access to our expert leaders in education and knowledge systems. And so I think from that time it set a really, I think one of your words was a systemic barrier for Te Reo Māori and a particular, I think, a particular view of how Māori education and how Te Reo Māori then become viewed was set during those early times. And Dr. Peter Meihana, he wrote a PhD on Māori privilege and the idea of Māori privilege, and it's still a thing that we hear today, oh, that's Māori privilege, this is about Māori privilege. But the genesis of that idea was from early settlers wanting Māori land and Māori resource. So the catch cry of the time was Māori are privileged, Māori are privileged. And of course, over 150 years later, that catch cry still carries those same connotations that it did from that time, but we very much are not privileged. We very much do not have our own Te Reo Māori our tikanga Māori complete belief system still intact. So there's kind of an imbalance between what we hear and what we think about Māori education and te reo Māori, and of course what the reality is. And that was set from those very early institutional processes, institutional barriers to us developing as a people.
Tēnā koe. And thank you for reframing what education is, what mātauranga is, because Rawiri, wānanga and ways of learning always existed for us, as Te Rina points out. That is very much core in our existence, ne?
Absolutely. I mean, if it weren't for wānanga, we wouldn't have arrived in Aotearoa. It was no mistake. It was not a chance sailing. It was a deliberate act. And they used, in terms of, some of the barriers, some of the challenges, Stacey, and just following on from what Te Rina said, putting that all together is that what I believe is the most significant single barrier is us as Māori becoming aware of what actually happened to us.
Kia ora.
Of everything that happened to us. Because Pākehā will never understand the gravity, the enormity of the loss. Pākehā will never understand because they were the protagonists and the significant recipients of colonization and colonialization. Colonization of the land, colonialization of the Māori ideologies, all those sorts of things. And it has been so successful. And until more of us, and that's the beauty of having this conversation in English today, because if we're saying it in Māori, only those who understand Māori will get it, and that's like preaching to the converted. So I'm happy to be talking to hopefully the hundreds and thousands of our brethren who will listen to this, and to say, come on now, Wama, be brave, take a step. Find out what actually happened to us, because our arrival in Aotearoa was no mistake, it was no accident, but what happened to us was also no accident. It was a deliberate and a systematic and deliberate acts of legislation over many, many years that has led to us being subjugated, being oppressed. And people say, come on, man, get over yourself. Well, it's not about getting over ourselves. It's about becoming aware of what happened to us. How come we are so prevalent in the prison system? How come we are so prevalent in the negative health statistics? How come we are so prevalent in the poverty statistics? And you just have to, and all of these statistics, they are a roadmap to understanding what has happened to us as a people. And until we take the chance to find out exactly what happened to us, I talk about te whakataia watanga, te whakariwaitanga, the making us becoming like potatoes, te whakamōkaitanga. And they said, that was all in the past, But, we still haven't learned. We still haven't learned from the ills of the past. We still haven't learned about how deep the hurt, how deep the loss went with us. And particularly, if I was to pick on one thing in particular, it is our spirituality as a people. And if we could begin to return te ngākau Māori, te mana Māori, te mauri Māori, me te wairua Māori, those aspects of spirituality to us as a people, I think that so much more would follow a lot more quickly.
Yeah. And yet we have to relearn the brilliance of what always existed in te ao Māori. And so I know growing up, I've been robbed of the understanding of the brilliance of my ancestors, and yet being taught that they just accidentally landed here. And that propagation of inferiority te rina ne. That's what an education system does. And this is the colonial playbook around the world, isn't it? You rob Indigenous peoples of their language so that they believe they're inferior. Ne? Koina tō whakarāpopoto, how do we describe that? Because Rawiri's just said we've got to lean into this reality of what has happened.
Yeah, I think if you look at the process of colonisation around the world, particularly with Indigenous peoples, and where settler colonies were established, Canada, America, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, the playbook was the same. And of course, what you do initially is you undermine education systems and you undermine knowledge systems, philosophies and ideologies. And that pretty much is the core of a culture of a nation. And so when you can de-establish or destabilise that particular element of a culture and a civilization, then it makes all of the other processes a lot easier and a lot smoother for the taking over of those people. When they can forget who they are and where and how they are connected to the lands that are being stolen from them, then it makes the colonial project a lot smoother in terms of how they come to overtake us. And I think that has been one of the beauties of the revitalisation of Te Reo Māori, so through Te Kohanga Reo in the 80s, and the work around the petition during the 70s also coincided with the development of early thinking for Te Wānanga o Raukawa and their philosophy whakatupuranga ruamano, so to grow a new generation for the new millennium, which focused a lot on Te Reo Māori. And of course, those of us who have been students at Te Wānanga o Raukawa know that you must do reo and you must do hapu and iwi studies, because it's part of that remembering who we are, remembering our brilliance. And that one of the things that I have seen through looking at the process of education and the history of education in Aotearoa is that the revitalisation of the language is just as much, or probably more importantly, about the revitalisation of the Māori spirit and the revitalisation of the wairua and the mauri associated to that. And I think that has been one of the critical parts, that Te Reo Māori is the vehicle by which we revitalise who we are as a people. And I think that's a really important part to remember, that in revitalising our language, it was more about revitalising the spirit of us as a people.
Aye, and as Sir James Henare said, ko te reo te Māori o te mana Māori. So in te reo Māori, we have the life force of mana for Māori. So Rawiri, when people look to you and look to Kura Kaupapa, are the structures now set so that tamariki Māori can have a Māori education experience? Is the autonomy there now?
The structure is in place, but the autonomy is what we continue to fight for. Doesn't matter what flavour the government is, that is still the next significant, the most significant next step. And that is, but I just want to pick up a little bit on what Te Rina was saying about, there are 5 pillars of colonisation: church, education, parliament, the media. That's why it was called the Fourth Estate.
Kia ora.
Right? And of course the militia. And so ngā pau o te whaka noho whenua, pillars of colonisation. But and that's what so many of us are now working on, is that, and we're trying to use these same pau in order to emancipate ourselves and to become more Māori. And so you look at the different efforts within. I don't think it really matters what of the major faiths you look at, whether it's Anglicanism or Catholicism. There have been significant moves in there to Māorify that part of the belief. Certainly in education, as Te Rina said, Kohanga Reo, Kura Kaupapa Māori, the recent growth of Kura a iwi, the wānanga structures, certainly what's happening in the media. Would we be having this discussion today if it wasn't for the developments of Māori production houses and companies and those sorts of things. And they're doing amazing stuff, And prior to the petition, none of this was even thought of, So it's fantastic. And of course, in terms of the militia, at least we now, if there was a positive in the statistics, is that we are significantly represented in the armed forces. So, okay, getting back, the structures are in place for tamariki to have a total education in Māori with being derived from mātauranga Māori. But we also have in Te Ao Matu, say kia kaua ngā tamariki herea ki te ao kohatu. And as much as it's really important to locate them within their own Māori world, within their own hapu, whānau, iwi, etc., it's also important that they are, outwardly looking. So we say that we are culturally located, but future focused. And the authority and autonomy, those are the two aspects there. And that's why we continue to ask for some are saying a Māori education authority. And I say we, I'm talking about Te Matakahuki, which is a amalgamation of Kohanga Reo, Kura Kaupapa Māori, Kura a Iwi, and the Wānanga structures. And we've come together under the umbrella of Te Matakahuki. And what we're saying, we've refined that a little bit to say that there ought to be a Māori, a kaupapa Māori education authority. So because it's distinct, because you can go to any of mainstream schools and you can do language, you can do aspects of tikanga, you can do kapahaka, you can do whatever else, but it's in a Pākehā framework. So that happens over there in its own style and its own way. But we're saying if you want a tūturu Māori, which really explores and enables a person to be their Māori self, then here is the pathway. And that is the pathway because the state, it says that has responsibility for the education of all tamariki. Okay, so be it. But their preference, and this is over years, 200 years now, is that they've really only looked after what we now call the kura aunua.
Ai, kia ora.
And what happens over there. And fine, let them do that, but let us have authority over what happens in this part of the education system. And if anybody's thinking that this is separatist, it's not. It's parallel.
Well, it's interesting because actually the Separatist Act is actually calling one mainstream and then othering the other stream.
Yeah, that's right.
Like I say English medium education rather than mainstream because immediately you're saying, well, here's the one that mainly is important and then here's the Māori one.
Yeah.
But I mean, if I can just compliment you and no te wahi kotahi tātou engari, but just to compliment your tamariki, Rawiri, are an example of future creators. They're building futures and they are amazing examples of their dexterity across culture as well as being Māori akene, really Māori in their existence. So I know that this is the potential that we have, Te Rina, but when we Māoriify education, as Rawiri said, it's not always at an equal standing point. Because if I think about how Te Reo Māori is spoken about, people are told this is not an academic subject. You can't combine some subjects with Te Reo Māori. The threads aren't always there. The courses, sometimes Te Reo Māori clashes in NCA with, say, calculus, making an assumption that a child who takes one won't take the other. What are some of those structural issues that you see are still barriers for Te Reo Māori learners?
Well, where do I start? I think most definitely there are those immediate issues that we see, clashes in timetabling, the undervaluing of Te Reo Māori as an academic subject. And for anybody who has ever tried to piece their whakapapa together, you will see that is more than an academic exercise.
And scientific.
And all the ethics, because sometimes it still blows my mind when I hear about different nuances in the whakapapa and how they're linked. But it's the continual undervaluing of Te Reo Māori as a language, which is reflective of the undervaluing of who we are as a people, which is embedded, and it comes from those early legislations and the early attitude of colonisers and the colonial settlers to remove us from, one, our land, but also from our language and from our culture as a people. Because if we look at some of the other systemic barriers that occur, not only in the clashes in timetabling, but even at university level, we have that same thing. Do I turn up to my pōhiri, which is at the same time as my first lecture, when I would like to seek access to Te Reo Māori services? Are they available to me? Well, they're not. And this is one of the issues that we're continually faced with, or that teachers, primary teachers in particularly, tell us all the time. The Māori privilege funding, the Māori factor funding that gets given to schools in order to support better pathways for learning for Māori children, often that resource is being co-opted by the school and redirected in a way that the school feels is more necessary. I hear teachers talking about, for example, getting some guitars, getting some rugby balls and basketballs, because that's what Māori children use. Well, Māori children also use beakers and Bunsen burners. Māori children also use protractors and scientific calculators. So there's still this underlying attitude of devaluing who we are as a people. And it all kind of hinges on some of the old attitude, those early colonial attitudes towards us as a people. But we find this in all Indigenous places where there are early colonial settlers on those lands. You look at Australia, it is the same there. America, with our Native American relations that live there, and in Canada, Hawaii. It's the same underlying thing, that when, in order for colonisation to remove a people, they must also impact on their culture and on their language. But I think some of the other ongoing barriers is when we get to this place of, like you say, the mainstream English language, and it has to be for everybody's good. We get to a place where we need to have, this is about public good, and it must be good for all students, it must be good for all people. And if we identify that this is particularly focused on Māori students or on the Māori language, then it becomes separatist. And I think that is an issue that we face as well, this idea that everything has to be beneficial for all people. And if we look at things like equity...
To be justified.
Yeah, to be justified. And if we look at things like equity and equal outcomes and equality of outcomes in education, then of course we see they must be different, because every child's learning pathway is different. Every child's learning capacity and ability is different. And so our structures must be able to cope with and change with those, so that every child can learn to the fullest of their potential. And so for some people it might be rocket science. For other people, it might be about business development, and for some children, it might be about producing the next Massey or Rob Ruha, or excellence in terms of musical talent and musical ability. So not every child, I think it's very Western for us to look at a situation and just think, oh, they all have to fit into this box. But we know that as Māori, we are very diverse, and we have diverse needs, just as we have diverse talents. And the way in which we set about developing and nurturing those different talents has to be different for each person, for each child. And of course, what we see now in each different kind of learning system, whether that's kura kaupapa, kura a, iwi, kohanga reo, placed in different places, they all have to have their own unique approach for the children and the learners that they are catering for. So I think that's another level that our government, our ministries, our institutions cannot cater for diversity in the way that we do naturally as Māori.
So I was going to talk about the interface at a different level at whare wānanga. Once we get to universities, Rawiri, we know that students who've come from Kura Kaupapa and Wharekura, that transition to university can be hard because of the nature of the university. What have you seen and what would you like to see?
Oh, absolutely. The and this is koe nei tako rikariki ki ngā whare wānanga Pākehā nei. This is what really upsets me about the Pākehā education universities around the country, is that to my knowledge there is only one program that a student can do entirely in Māori from year 1 to year 3. And it is the teacher training course that Te Rina and others look after at Massey University. Even the tikanga Māori or the mātauranga Māori programs that are delivered are not delivered entirely in Māori. They all want our students, and yet they have done nothing to put programs in place that are going to help them to enhance what they have learned so far, right? And that's why a significant number of our kids do not do well in year 1 in the Pākehā universities. It's not because they're not able. That's the thing. They are more than capable of doing it, but it is the culture shock of what they are confronted with. I was talking to a former one of our raukura, our graduates, just last week, and he never experienced racism until he got to university, and maybe is that our fault? Is that our fault as a kura that we haven't put them into positions where they're, have we nurtured them too much? And I don't believe that we need to be second guessing ourselves on that. I don't believe that we have nurtured them too much. I don't believe that we have given them too much love, but because what that support helps them to see is that even if they do fall over in the first year, at least they have, they've got the resilience to come back up. They might then take another gap year and go and do something else. But then if some of the statistics that I've seen recently is that in terms of returning students, a number of, Māori students go back. They go in their first year, may not do very well, go and do something else for a year or a little bit more, but eventually they go back and finish. And that's the resilience, But that also tells us that the universities need to be doing more, not so prevalent in the technical institutes, because they seem to have better support systems in place there for students. But really noticeable in the universities, in the Pākehā universities.
That's an interesting observation about whether it's because there's a vocational focus usually with kuratini, like you're saying. But I mean, what I also see is a lot of Māori staff in universities around the country trying to carry the load, trying to make it better. Yeah. But actually, it's the structures that will make it harder.
It's the institution, yeah. It's the institutional stuff that needs to change, because there are some fantastic people in some of our people, and some of the leading brains of Māoridom are scattered throughout the universities of the country, and they're doing amazing work. But each institution needs to be doing more in order to make themselves more not just attractive, but more pliable and amenable to be helping not just Māori students, but Pacifica students also, students of other cultures in more meaningful ways. That's the challenge for them.
Anna.
We only have only 6% of Māori have university entrance. And so what we see is that there's a small number of Māori coming through secondary schools with the qualification to go straight into universities, 6%. And so what we see at at one of the lower levels is that at NCA level 3, for example, the Māori pass rate is around 65%. So only 65% of Māori are passing at that level. But worse than that, only those amount of Māori that have managed to hang on to the secondary school system, to the final year of secondary school. And then we get these numbers. But if we look at those numbers, a national pass rate for Māori in secondary schools, and when we put that alongside the pass rates that are coming out of Kura Kaupapa Māori, we can see that Kura Kaupapa Māori are around 90% pass rate. So, and with a less of a drop-off. And so what that says to me, and I've looked at these numbers, I look at these numbers every year to see what are our national pass rates at secondary schools for our tamariki and what do they look like alongside Kura Kaupapa Māori, Kura iwi, and also Māori boarding schools. They don't change the statistical range, and they're still only around 5% of our tamariki at these schools. But what we see is that they're outperforming some of the high decile, high schools in the country, and they are te reo Māori-based schooling options. And so you've got to wonder, what are these schools doing in order to be sites of success for tamariki Māori that the rest of the schools are not doing? Our English medium schools, mainstream English language options for secondary schooling, what are Kura doing that these other ones are not doing? And I remember back to the 90s when there was this first kind of development of the brain drain, and Dr. Peter Sharples at the time, he was saying, if we're so concerned about our brain drain, about our educated people leaving, why don't we just create more educated people that might stay at home? And he indicated then in the 90s that perhaps we should be looking at the process of Kura and the structures of Kura in order to create more educational success across the board, not just for Māori, but for all people. What are they doing as a successful structure of education? What is happening there that is not happening in these other places? And of course, that was the 90s. So 30 odd years ago, he was asking these questions, and we still, as a nation, have not come to terms with the fact that these schooling options are preparing our children better in the education forum than any other system, and yet we still deny support, whether that be financial support, whether that be building support. We still deny those successful structures the adequate support in order to create more educational success for all tamariki. So I think we have to have that kind of hard reflection on what we're doing as a nation, and why is it that we continue to pretend that these sites of education success do not exist in this country, and why we continue to undervalue and undersell those educational structures that are completely successful. Because then if you look at going into university, what we see is a small number of Māori coming in, and we see university systems being ill-equipped in order to cater for that few percentage. So I always talk in university, I look at Māori students as being absolute taonga, because they are the 6% who jumped through all the flaming hoops of secondary school in order to get to this privileged position of being able to come to a university, and they absolutely deserve all of our support that we can give them at a university level. If they've managed to survive a really horrific system thus far by themselves, with them and their whānau, the least we can do at a university is to extend our hand and say, actually, I'm going to help you through the rest of this journey, because we also know only 4% of Māori will end up with a bachelor's degree, 2% with a postgraduate degree, and 1% with a doctoral degree. So at every step along the way, they are becoming more and more unique, kind of like little unicorns, if you will, like little patupaere here that just seem to get through the slimmest of gaps that they are afforded. And so I feel like it is definitely the responsibility of the university to extend just the common courtesy to acknowledge how they've managed to end up where they are. But of course, like you say, for Māori staff in those spaces, they do take on more of that responsibility because we know the journey that they've come along and the journey that they still have to go to. And I'm always kind of pushed forward by the idea also that the median Māori income is around $23,000 a year. I don't know how anybody's supposed to buy a house with that. But if you have a university degree, some type of degree, you automatically jump to $53,000 a year. Like that is an instant gain in terms of your socioeconomic stability for you and for your whānau. So I think not only do we carry as university, people working in the university, we don't just carry the obligation as Māori, but we carry all of that responsibility because we can identify with their learning journey and what they can potentially contribute to their immediate whānau, to their hapu, to their iwi, and to the communities that they go back to as well. So I guess the responsibility is not just for one, ehara taku toi te toa takitahi, but we're in it for our collective well-being and for all of our mokopuna, because it's not just my mokopuna, it's not just your mokopuna, it is the mokopuna that will end up in all Māori communities across the country, hopefully around the world.
Kia ora. So, hei kōrero whakamutunga pēr, Rawiri, when Te Rina said, what do these kura do? What do these sites of success do? Can you give us a little matapihi, a little window into what Kura Kaupapa Māori do that creates such sites of success?
Ka aro haina nui tia te tamaiti. We just love them, and we believe that every child arrives to this earth with knowing. If we accept the notion that, the baskets of knowledge, the mauri of knowledge was brought from the heavens and bestowed into the earth, then we are people of the earth, we are tangata whenua, then by that connection, the knowledge and understanding and awareness is within us. And so what is the purpose of the kura? One of the purposes of the kura is to create as many opportunities, situations, experiences as possible that helps tamariki to discover where their own talents may lie. And then identifying it, experiencing is one, identifying it and then enhancing it is the other thing. And always encouraging tamariki that they can do it. They might not get it right first, or but paikia to mātea ha te mahi, mahi ha te mahi. He manga wai koe e kore whitiga. How do you know if you'll be able, what may or may not be able to cross that stream unless you try? So it's about using all of those tidbits of knowledge that have been passed down over thousands of years, not just since we've been here in Aotearoa. That's one thing that I think we forget, is that we think about mātauranga Māori as sort of beginning when we got here, and we forget that we have we draw on thousands of years of knowledge, which has been passed down and passed down and passed down. And so that's what we do, is to love the child unconditionally, help them to discover where their potential lies, to explore that, to magnify that, to give them other options so that when they're ready to take on the world, they're doing something that they're already interested in. And if that doesn't go to plan, then they know that there are other things that they can do. So, we're encouraging them to look broadly.
And it's broad, the ways that you teach as well, that you see teaching in the environment and the taiao and our whakairo, and the ways that we understand knowledge is different. And just quickly as the last question, because I know we're running out of time, but when now Te Reo Māori is pretty hot in lots of spaces and people want to learn, but getting enough Te Reo Māori teachers is difficult, where should our focus be?
I think that our focus should actually be on on teachers understanding what their role is as a treaty partner. So whether or not you can speak Te Reo Māori, your intentions on fulfilling your responsibilities and obligations of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, that I feel like that should be number one, because when we get to a point to understand what our role is as a good treaty partner, then all of the systems and institutions and processes that flow from it, of course, are going to benefit Māori development, Māori education, and therefore Te Reo Māori. So I feel like there should be a bigger focus on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and being a good treaty partner. And if this means that we establish an independent kaupapa Māori education authority, if that's what being a good treaty partner looks like, then that's what being a good treaty partner looks like. If devolving all power and authority to Māori is being a good treaty partner, then we should be devolving all power and authority to Māori. So I think for me, it comes back to that one step, again, a little one step backwards. But also in our current environment, we need to acknowledge some of our key critical workers in appropriate ways. So whether they're teachers, whether they're nurses, whether they are firemen, these are all hot topics of the moment. We need to acknowledge the critical role that they play in keeping our communities safe, but also in growing what we hope would be awesome communities for our Mokopuna. So acknowledge the mahi that they do. And I feel like if we do that, then some of the other stuff will just start to fall into place and take care of itself with good strategies, good intentions, and good outcomes to fulfilling what all of our tūpuna dreamed about in 1840, or if they, in terms of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the aspirations of a better future for all of our tamariki.
There's two things to add to that. One is that we need to be growing our own and looking at our senior students now and those who expressing a thought about becoming a teacher. I think those, because that's where the longevity of the Kura Kaupapa Māori system will be self-perpetuating, but it's also to give people who are native speakers already, who might have been doing something else for 20 or 30 years, and saying to them, hey, have you ever thought about making a career change?
Making it doable.
Yeah? And it's you and your ngākau and your reo that we want first. We can teach you how to become a teacher, but if you've already got a skill, if you've already got something that you can do, and I don't mean a skill that they may or may not have a qualification for, it's just something that they can do, a passion, then we should be looking to invite those people in as well, and looking at ways of giving them in-service training so that you've got the newbies coming up through the university system who we've already grown through Kura Kaupapa Māori, and then you've got those who've already been out in the world for 10, 15, 20, 30 years maybe, and who never thought, for whatever reason, that they could be a kaiako, when in fact they're probably some of the best potential kaiako around. Your uncles and your aunties, those ones who are, tautu, hari, marae, and you think, now, auntie, uncle, why did you never go and be a teacher, And they, and they sort of fob it off. But there is room. There's room for all of those sorts of people in education right now. And if all what Te Rina said, and if these other things can be happening together, we can have a really diverse education workforce.
Tēnā rawatu kōrua. As we talk about revitalisation, you've revitalised so many aspects of this kōrero, partially by reframing our understanding of what education is, what it always has been in terms of mātauranga Māori, and reimagining our future for Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nō reira, tēnei ka mihi kia kōrua tahi.
Hei kōna rā.
Kia ora.
You've been listening to Conversations That Count, Ngā Kōrero Whai Take. brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Massey University. It was hosted by Stacey Morrison. It was produced by Te Aihe Butler, with content management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee. Special thanks to our partnerships editorial team of Matthew McCauley and Elisa Rivera. Study online, on campus, or both with Massey University. To find out more, visit massey.ac.nz. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.